outfit in Pakistan. Not sorting out the postal dispute despite days of talks, it looks likely strikes will start tomorrow.
It breaks my heart to say it, but I'm leaving you.
And Peggy's off. Barbara Windsor said she's leaving the soap after 15 years.
On BBC London, no longer an emergency. People stuck in lifts may not be rescued by the fire service, and how this siege led to the discovery of an IRA hit list, including Buckingham Palace.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. It was a story of incompetence, complacency and cost-cutting. That was the damning indictment of the Ministry of Defence in a report out today on the RAF Nimrod crash 3 years ago. All 14 servicemen on board died when leaking fuel touched a hot pipe and caused the plane to explode. The review said those deaths were preventable and that financial cuts within the MOD had led to changes in both regime and culture. Our defence correspondent Caroline Wyatt is outside the Ministry of Defence now. Caroline.
This report, more than 500 pages of damning criticism, incisive analysis of what went wrong, is what 14 families have waited a long time for. They say it is for them a vindication. It points the finger at least 10 individuals whom they blame for safety failings, and it looks at a culture that failed the 14 servicemen who died that day. 14 lives that should never have been lost. These were the servicemen who died over Kandahar in 2006 as a result of what the Nimrod Review today termed sloppiness, complacency and a military airworthiness system that was not fit for purpose. Today, the chairman of the review, Charles Haddon Cave, QC, delivered more than 500 coruscating pages in a damning report that condemned systemic and significant failures at the MOD, the RAF and within two of Britain's leading defence companies, BAE Systems and Kinetic.
Tragically, for the crew of XV-230, the lessons have come too late and at an infinite price. The most fitting memorial to the loss of the crew of XV-230 will be that the lessons from their sacrifice are truly learned and the recommendations set out in my report are fully implemented.
The review said that the Nimrod safety case that could have avoided the crash was a lamentable job from start to finish. It was riddled with errors, and its production was a story of incompetence, complacency and cynicism. The families of the servicemen who died have waited 3 long years for 10 of those deemed responsible to be publicly named. Graham Knight, who lost his son Ben, says the real responsibility, though, goes right to the top.
This government and the previous government have cut defence, and that's cost lives.
I think there should be resignations from someone at the top for, like I said, for allowing this to happen and for how they've knocked us down over the last 3 years, making out everything was fine when we knew it wasn't, and this has just proved it.
Do recalibrate that.
In the House of Commons, the Defence Secretary Bob Ainsworth offered them this apology.
The report's a tough read. The subtitle of the report, A Failure of Leadership, Culture and Priorities, is a stark judgment. We're determined to address this, and the clear message in this report that we have to do more.
14 families entrusted the lives of their sons, their husbands, their brothers to the RAF in the belief this aircraft was safe. The review's conclusion that financial pressures and cuts allowed business to eclipse airworthiness will leave much for the MOD and others to address. Well, this was probably the most damning report into the MOD in living memory, and tonight many here and elsewhere will be looking at their consciences, working out how best to implement the reforms advised by the review. BAE Systems tonight gave this statement saying it would consider and assess how best to support the Ministry of Defence in the implementation of those recommendations to improve processes to enhance the operational safety of aircraft in military use. And the families themselves will also consider their next move if there are no resignations.
Caroline, thank you. Caroline Wyatt from outside the MOD. MPs won't be able to claim for mortgages on their second homes, food or retirement grants under planned cuts to their expenses. The BBC has learned that an independent review, which is due out next week, will also ban them from employing their relatives. The party leaders say the plans must be accepted, but many MPs say they will fight the changes, as our Deputy Political Editor James Nowdale reports.
The horse might have bolted, but the parliamentary gate to expenses is now being well and truly closed. There'll be no more claims for mortgages and no more family on MP's staff. But that's not all. There'll be no more grants for retiring or defeated MPs, no more allowances for leafleting voters, no more day-to-day cash for food and taxes, and a cutback on first-class travel.
Stephen Hammond's office.
This is Stephen Hammond's secretary and his wife. Under Sir Christopher Kelly's plans, he would have to sack her, at least eventually. She would have up to 5 years to find a different job.
I've worked in the Commons for 25 years. Only the last 4.5 years have I worked for my husband. And so I do think I was the best person to work for my husband. I've got lots of years of experience in the Commons. And then recently, obviously, I know Wimbledon extremely well.
The problem is that the former Tory MP Derek Conway muddied the waters. When it emerged he'd paid his son for work he hadn't done. MPs who live within a 60-minute train ride of London will no longer be able to claim for their second homes. They'll have no choice but to commute at their own expense.
We want to attract good women into the House of Commons. Are we seriously saying that a lady leaving the House at 11 o'clock at night is going to travel by train back to her constituency and then possibly have to travel from the train station back home? It's not realistic.
And I've been told there'll be cuts in expenses across the board. A resettlement grant for defeated or retiring MPs worth more than £64,000 will be replaced with a much smaller fixed rate. A controversial communications allowance for MPs' leaflets and questionnaires worth over £10,000 a year will be scrapped. And a subsistence allowance worth up to £9,000 a year for MPs' day-to-day expenses will go too. Many MPs have come unstuck over their mortgages. Elliot Morley is being investigated for claiming expenses on a mortgage he'd paid off. But some colleagues think it's time to bite the bullet and give them up.
We've got to have a fresh start, and there will be pain. There will be a lot of pain. But I think many of us, even people who didn't claim for second home allowance, have got to realise that we were complicit in that process, and it's payback time.
But some MPs are angry and want to vote on the changes in the Commons. The signs tonight, though, are that that door is closing too.
Let's talk to James Landale now from the House of Parliament. And James, you're saying that door's closing now. Does that mean MPs won't have a say? They'll just have to live with the changes?
Well, Sian, that's a very, very good question, because if you believe the words of Jack Straw, the Justice Secretary, he told MPs in June that when Sir Christopher Kelly's recommendations are made in the autumn, they would, and I quote him precisely, will be subject to approval by this House. In other words, MPs would get a vote. But tonight it's very, very clear that actually that isn't the case. What is clear is that in the summer, MPs devolved the whole responsibility for expenses to an outside body, a newly created independent parliamentary standards authority. And it is that body, not MPs, not ministers, who are going to decide what's implemented or not. But one small problem, don't hold your breath. The IPSA, as we must call this body, doesn't actually exist. It's one man and a dog in some rented offices in the Ministry of Justice, and says on its website it won't be operational until the spring. So we've got some way to go on this.
We have. Thanks very much, James. Pakistan and Afghanistan have both been hit by devastating bomb attacks today. In Pakistan, more than 90 people were killed and hundreds more injured when a marketplace was targeted in Peshawar. In the Afghan capital, Kabul, bombers attacked a guest house, killing 5 United Nations staff and 3 Afghans. The UN Secretary-General called it a shocking and shameless act. In a moment, Ian Pannell on the Kabul attack. First, from Peshawar, here's Orla Guerin.
Chaos and carnage returned to Peshawar. Shops ablaze and lives destroyed. The city was on high alert, but still the bomber got through. The location, this busy marketplace, full of stalls selling children's toys and women's jewellery. This was the softest of targets. "My son died here," he said. Locals tried to find survivors, then this. The bomber parked